Hello everyone and welcome to our Django workshop. So when you talk about Django, you might think of this, but actually today we're talking about the Python Django. And what is Django exactly and what is it used for? So Django is a web framework for perfectionists with deadlines. And it's actually a really popular tool to create web apps. It provides a high-level back-end web framework, but it also has a lot of other built-in features that you can add on to it. And the great thing is, there's a large online community around it that welcomes both newcomers and professionals. So, I mean, everyone's welcome. It's really easy to start working with Django. Django is also good because it's fast, it's secure, and provides your web application with scale. And actually, a lot of popular websites and applications that you're used to use Django as a framework, as like, for example, Instagram, Spotify, and even NASA. So yeah, it's nice to give it a try. Now we're gonna talk about core functionalities, and I'm gonna pass on to Victor.
All right, thank you, Anna. And let's dive into the core functionalities of Django. Every Django project has a model view template framework. You may have heard model view controller before, which is also a framework often used in software development. And the Django designers definitely had this in mind when they conceptualized the model view template framework. But this one is actually different in a number of ways, which we will talk about now. So you can think of ModelViewTemplate as a three-layered logic where the model handles the back end and the template the front end. More specifically, the model is just a Python file basically that contains different classes, and you can think of these classes as data frames. And these data frames have different columns, which are the attributes which you can specify in the class. And every instance of the class is then a line, so an observation in your data frame. So you basically specify your data structure in the model. So that's really important because then in the view, which communicates between the model and the template, you can access the data via the model, but you can also create, update, and delete new data. So the view is basically the communicator between model and template, and it takes the user input from the template and forwards it to the model, but it also takes the data from the model and forwards it for presentation to the template, which will present it to the user. So the view also is a Python file, just like the model is, and the view contains different methods that handle the presentation, so the accessing data from the model and forwarding to template, and also for storing data from user input via the model. And the template then is not a Python file, but it's basically a directory which contains HTML files where you can design your application. So it's not only there to present data, obviously, but it also takes user input usually every web application. And in the template, you can specify how that happens via HTML documents. And we will also talk about forms and authentication in more detail now. And these are special forms of user input, obviously. And that's why we have the arrow here from template to model, because the template will specify how the user input looks like and will then forward it via the view to the model where the data is then stored. On the lowest level, the model has all the information about the data that is being used by the web application. And you can see an example here for a person model, which has a first name and a last name. And every model in Django is a Python class, and every model creates a database table that handles the database interactions. Connecting the model and the template is the view, which retrieves the data from the database via the model features, formats it, and then returns it to the template. And as you can see in the example, the view always takes a web request, so an HTTP request, and then also returns an HTTP response object. In the template, you can decide on how the web application should look like. So when Django was first conceptualized, the designers wanted to have a really easy to use interface where you don't need to be able to code to design the web application. And you can see here on the right that it's just a marked up strings with variables and filters. And when you render this string, you will then access the database via those variables, and you will see a very beautiful web application. An important part of every web application obviously is handling user input, because you don't only want to present the information, but you also want to take input and make it interactive. And Django makes that very easy by providing a form library. You can see an example here for a generated form from an existing model, which just takes the name as input and then forwards it so you can actually work with it as data in your Python project. A special case of forms are authentications, and Django can do that with a built-in authentication system which handles both the verifying part and also the authorization. So you can check whether a person is who he claims to be, and then also decide on what he's allowed to do inside your application. So as we said before, Django is a really secure environment and makes it very easy to have security built in from the start when designing your web application. And let's move on now with the setup and installation of Django. But before we do that, I'd like to quickly recap what we've learned so far. Anna introduced you to Django and showed you why it's so valuable in designing your own web application. She also talked about why Django is so popular in the Python community and about everything that you can do with it to get started on your own project. Then I talked about the model view and template framework that is so easy to use and the basis of every Django project to control the back and the front end of your web app. But to actually get started and build your own project, you first need to, of course, install Django on your own machine. It's a Python package, but you still need to follow the steps that Reed will show you in the next slides to actually install Django on your machine and get started with it. And then Benedict will show you a real-world example of something that you will always need in your own web application with a known file that we created, which you can also find in the GitHub link on the last slide on our resources. So if you want to do something yourself and create your first web app basically within Django, just follow the GitHub link and try it on your own basically. But let's first learn how to set up and install Django on your machine with Reed.
Thanks, Victor. So I'm going to be going over how to install Python and Django on your computer. First, we're going to make sure that we have Python installed on your computer. You can do this either by going in Google and searching Python and downloading the latest Python from python.org, or you can go to Homebrew within a Unix or Mac terminal and downloading it that way. You can also then check your Python version to make sure you have it up and running and installed on your computer by the following code on the screen, Python 3 or Python -- version. Then we're going to make sure to install Django. You're going to either open your shell or your command prompt line, such as terminal or PowerShell, and then enter Python -p-m pip install Django. And that installs it as a package within your Python on your computer. Then, of course, you're going to want to make sure to check the version that was installed on your computer of Django by going to Python -m Django -- version, or Pi if you're running a Windows computer. This will then give you the latest version of Django. Then you can go online and Google on Django, which we have the resources on at the end, where to find that, to make sure that you're running the latest stable version of Django. Then, afterwards, you're going to want to set up your first project within Django. This will automatically create your Django project directory, which will be a list of files that we'll see in the next slide. You can do this by doing Django-admin, start project, and then naming it whatever you would like to name it. In this context, we've called it my site. Once you have it up and running, it should look like this within your folder. It should be the my site or whatever you've called it, the manage.py. Then within that, you should have all of the following files. These are the standard files that come within Django when you initialize it. After initialization, you're going to want to check whether or not your project is working properly. And you can do this when it's in a really satisfying way by going to Python manage.py run server. And this sets up the first web server to access the admin end version of Python using the admin credentials. Then you'll get an output like this at the bottom of your screen, and you can follow the http / etc. Or you can do localhost 8000. And that will allow you to see the following, which is this web page here, and that means that it was installed correctly. I'm going to then pass it on to Benedict, who's going to show you the demonstration.
So thank you, Reed, and let's jump right into this demonstration of what you can actually do with Django and what kind of applications you can create. So for demonstrating that, we actually thought about a little use case all of you have encountered when surfing the web, and that is this basic login, logout procedure and registering on a new website you want to become a user of. So let's dive right in and register here on this web application we set up. So register now. I'm going to do this real quick. I'm selecting a username, Django with 3O. I will add an email address. So just something that looks like an email address, because that will be checked by Django, whether it actually validates the basic criteria of an email address. And use Google to suggest a password and sign up. Great, that worked. And Google is also as nice to just fill it in here for me. So let's log in. Ooh, yeah, that worked. So, and also uses here my username. So Django with 3O, you're signed in. So let's log out again. Yes, okay, great. That worked. So I hope now you're all excited to see how this is actually working in the code implementation. So let's switch over to the IDE PyCharm. And let's check how we did that. So as Victor already explained in his little pictogram, Django and implementation Django basically works along these three pillars. That is the models, where the data structure is defined and where the data is stored. That is the views that actually interacts with the model and also creates new instances of data. And the templates, where all the user interaction is defined and where all my HTML files are stored. So let's start off here for this application, the login, logout application, and with the models part. And the models part here is very easy. So I had, of course, to define a kind of data structure, so a table you can think of, which is done by defining a class in Python that extends this models.model class, so that Django knows, okay, this class is actually a class that defines a model, a data structure. And all we had to include here was one field, and a field you can think of like a column in this table that we are about to define. And our table only has one field, and that's the user field. So basically a table with one column where each observation is a user that can be defined like that. So then we have defined our data structure. So the next thing would be, if you think back to the application I just showed you, to define this form that we actually can use to register as a new user, and of course is in the back end used to hand in data to Django that it can use to create a new object instance of this class profile. So basically a new user. So let's go over to another file that is the forms file. And here it looks very similar actually to the models file, but what you're specifying here is not a data table or a data structure, but a new register form that is again extending something, and that's the user creation form. So that already comes with Django. And again, when you create a class that extends this user creation form, then Django knows, okay, this class user register form is actually a user creation form and can be used to create new users, as the name suggests. So there are some defaults that come with it if you actually define a new user creation form. That is the username, password 1, and the confirmation password. But of course you can define additional fields, for example, as I did here, emails, and we just ask for an email address. So now we have defined the model, the data table. We have defined the form that we can use to create new object instances of that data table. So let's now actually come through the heart of Django, and actually the method that does the whole process of taking in the user data from the form and then creating this new object of the model structure. And that is of course happening in the views file. And here you have to create, or I had to create a new method that I called register that takes in the web request. So here you see as a method parameter, a request. And that's basically the request that one sends when you click on a submit button. So then the web request is taken in here, and there's some magic happening here that is very standard for just dealing with web form data and kind of creating new object instances then from the data you took in. So I will not go into detail here, but you see it's not much code, so it's really straightforward, and Django makes it really easy to do something like that. But this method is basically taking in the data, checking whether the form is validly filled, and then of course saving the form data, and then returning or redirecting the user to the login page after registration has been successfully achieved. So now, we have a new user account, and now you might be wondering, okay, this is all backend. So where is actually defined how the website looks and how the form looks, and why is there a Hertie logo on top? And that's all happening in the templates pillar, so the third big pillar of the pictogram that we have shown in the presentation. And the templates are stored in a separate directory in your web application, and it contains basically HTML files. So I'm sure you've all at least had a look at some HTML code in your life so far. So let's click on one very simple one, and that what you can see here is HTML code that actually specifies the home page that you see after logging in. And there's one special thing that I want to show you here in order to achieve that. For example, the username of the user that just logged in is depicted in the text, as you have seen before in the example. And this magic is happening by including a statement like that. So you see here this double bracket, then U in double bracket. And that is of course not a text you have seen on the website, but that is specifying a Django or a variable that is passed by the view method to the template file, so to the HTML file. And then it's going to be rendered as the value of the variable you just passed. And here I named the variable U for username, and you can see Django, that was our username in the example, was then put in here before the you're signed in. That would be static text. So yes, I think that sums it up pretty well. I hope now you got a basic grasp of how implementation in Django works, and how also these three pillars, models, views, and templates, work hand in hand in each other in order to create web applications with Django. So I would say now back to you, Reed.
Thanks, Benedict. That was great. We got to see how Django works in action. So now I'm going to move on to some further resources so you guys can go online and learn more, as well as to where to find the documentation. So here you'll see further resources such as a quick installation guide, which can be found on Django's website, a Django documentation guide, which will step you through all the steps you need to know on Django, as well as some great Django tutorials that we found on YouTube that we use, that we found super helpful on installation, developing your first app, getting things up and running.
Now going on Django!